Do you know why tick-borne illnesses are on the rise?
Well, it's actually more than just tick-borne illnesses. Earlier this year, the CDC came out with a report that said that insect-borne infections, ticks, mosquitoes, and to a much lesser degree fleas, have increased threefold in the last dozen years or so. And there are a number of reasons why that's true, starting with the expansion of the habitat of the insects themselves. The odd culprit in all of this is the bird. Because as it turns out, ticks will sometimes hitch a ride on migrating birds and end up in a completely different area, drop off and try to colonize that area. Or other times the birds themselves can be infected and then fly to another area where they might be bitten by a mosquito, and then the mosquito picks up the infection and starts to spread it locally. Then with regard, for instance, for the ticks that drop off and start to colonize, the other thing we have to keep in mind is that their favorite feeding animals are mice and deer and chipmunks, for instance, for the black-legged tick, which is the main transmitter of Lyme disease. And their numbers are up. There's a lot more mice, a lot more deer, and as a result, there's a lot more places for ticks to feed. And more feeding means more growing, more multiplying. And so the number of ticks increase, and along with it, the number of infected ticks increase. And so we see expansion of the area that's affected by tick-borne infections. Add to that, if nothing else, we have more mild winters. So the ticks are not dying out as much as they used to, and neither are the mice. And so come spring, things are ready to expand, and the epidemic of insect-borne infections is ready to take off.
Well, speaking of epidemic, what are the most serious problems that mosquito and tick bites can cause?
Well, there's quite a few, starting with ticks. More than 65 infections are transmitted by ticks, and unfortunately, a number of them can be fatal. Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which exists in a number of areas in the United States, if not diagnosed in a timely fashion, can be quite severe and even fatal. Other infections like anaplasmosis, ehrlichiosis, babesiosis, powassan, even tularemia can be life-threatening if not diagnosed and treated appropriately. Luckily, Lyme disease is unlikely to be life-threatening, but unfortunately, since there's so much of it, it conveys a huge burden to the health or illness of the population of the United States. If we look to mosquito-borne infections, West Nile virus is the most common mosquito-borne infection in the United States. It is rarely, but can be fatal as well. Other more famous fatal mosquito-borne infections like malaria and yellow fever luckily don't exist in mainland United States. But we see sometimes mini introductions of some of these other mosquito-borne infections. We had the problem with Zika around the Miami area for a brief time, and every so often we see some transmission of dengue or even chikungunya within the United States. So these are all causes and concerns for insect-related infections.
Well, gosh, I certainly don't want to come into contact with any of these pests. What do we do to keep them off us and not in our yards and off of our pets? What are things we can do?
So luckily there are a lot of things that we can do, and many of them are effective, starting with insect repellents. There are a variety of EPA-approved insect repellents that work, and I recommend using them. They're especially effective against ticks and mosquitoes. Not really very effective against stinging insects like bees and yellow jackets, but they'll keep the ticks and the mosquitoes at bay to a large degree, and if they're not biting you, you won't be getting infected from them. Another thing to consider is clothing. These insect-driven infections are clearly associated with warmer weather and summer activities, which is when we like to be out and about. And it's one thing to be in Main Street getting an ice cream in shorts and flip-flops. It's an entirely different thing to be camping and hiking in tick-infested areas. There you may want to reconsider your attire. You may want long pants, long-sleeved shirts, boots, tuck your pants inside your socks so that it is much less likely that the ticks can get on you and bite you, and the same is true for mosquitoes. And there are also clothing that you can buy that are impregnated with insect repellent. And so that's something else to keep in mind. So those are also more individual things we can do to reduce the risk of infection. Then the other concern is, well, what about around my home? What can I do? And, you know, starting with looking and sealing any cracks that might exist, you know, make sure that your screens are intact. You don't want the mosquitoes getting into the home and biting you, never mind driving you crazy as they buzz around you at night. I personally can't stand that, right? Ticks, luckily, don't normally work their way into the house unless we bring them in or our pets bring them in. And that goes to another thing that needs to be done, which is tick checks. And that's especially important if you've been hiking in an area with a lot of ticks. As it turns out, for instance, for Lyme disease, the tick needs to be latched on and feeding 24 to 48 hours before the infection is transmitted. So if you find the tick early after a hike, you've been out there for 8 hours and you find the tick and remove it, the likelihood that you'll get infected is very, very low. So tick checks become very important. And then around your house, in addition to the screens and so forth, it's worth doing an inspection of the outside. You don't want any standing water. Mosquitoes can breed in as little as a ½ an inch of water. So you want to drain the water. You want to make sure that your gutters and drains don't pool water, and you get rid of the standing water. With regard to your yard, you want to make sure that there isn't a lot of overgrowth of bushes and grasses, because the ticks will like to be there, and then you rub up against them and the tick will drop to you. You'd rather have a well-manicured lawn. You want to make that your walkways are free from clutter and bushes. Sometimes it's you're not sure what your risk is, or you know you have a risk, and I would recommend under those circumstances that you contact a pest professional who can evaluate your risk, the risks, and come up with a plan to mitigate and minimize your risk from these insects and the transmission of infections.
Now, if you do a tick check and you find something on yourself, your child, or your pet, how do you get rid of it? What's the safest way to remove a tick?
Okay, I've got 3 words for you: tweezers, tweezers, and tweezers. The home remedies of using Vaseline jelly and burning them and so forth is not the way to go. What you need is a nice pair of tweezers that you can, grasp the tick as close to the skin as possible and just firmly and steadily pull back. And the tick will come unlatched, it will come off. You don't want to jerk quickly, you don't want to twist, you don't want to do anything that will damage or crush the tick or leave the head and mouth parts behind. But slow but steady will remove the tick, and then you can just clean the area where the tick was, and then dispose of the tick, flush it down the toilet, seal it in a bag, and dispose of it, and you should be good to go.
Where are we most likely to come into contact with ticks? In our property, or let's say if you're going hiking? What are some of the things that we need to be on the lookout for?
Well, it really depends upon your geographic area. In some areas of the country, it really is in areas that are less developed, and you're hiking and you're camping. In other areas where there's really dense infestation with ticks and mice and deer, and we've seen this, for instance, all across the Northeast, and it's been spreading to elsewhere, you get the suburbanization of where there used to be forests. The tree areas get broken up. There's less hunting in suburbia, and you see deer populations thrive, even mice thrive, and so you get large amounts of ticks even in suburban backyards, and so you can even be at risk in suburban backyards. There are areas in Connecticut where they can look at a lawn and find many, many infected ticks. So it really depends upon your particular area.
And just 2 real quick questions for you. What is the National Pest Management Association? What's their role?
So this is an organization that works with and represents more than 5,000 pest professionals. It acts predominantly as a resource where there's information and tries to educate and increase awareness around pest-related concerns and problems like these insect-related infections.
And then quickly, where can we learn more? Where can we get more information?
Well, I would direct you to pestworld.org. It's a great resource, pestworld.org, where you can find a lot of what we've talked about, information that's right on topic, as well as many other interesting points.
Well, thanks for being with us. We really appreciate your time. You've been giving us such great information today.
Great. It's been my pleasure.